There's a corner on the west side of San Antonio where, for 30 years, you could tell what time it was by the smell. At 4 in the morning it was coffee and hot oil. By 5, it was onions on the flat top and the first pot of beans coming up to temperature. By 6:30, it was everything at once, and the men waiting outside for their trucks to fill up could smell it a block away in the dark. And that is how a lot of people in that part of town learned to tell time before they ever owned a watch that mattered. Settle in for this one. Turn the lamp down. Get the blanket where you want it. And let me tell you about that corner, and about a woman named Rosa, and about a metal box full of index cards that nobody could read. There is no villain in this story. I want to tell you that at the start so your shoulders can come down. Nobody is cheated. Nobody gets exposed at a family dinner. There is no folder of receipts, and no courtroom, and no revenge of any kind. It is a story about a debt that cannot be paid back, and about what people do about that anyway. And I think it is a good one to fall asleep to. It starts with a bus. In the spring of 1988, a man named Ernesto Delgado and his wife Alma got off a bus in San Antonio, Texas, with 2 suitcases, one of which had a broken latch and was held shut with a leather belt. He was 29 years old. She was 26. Between them, they had about 40 English words, and most of those were nouns. They slept for 6 weeks on the floor of a cousin's apartment on Zamora Street, in a room with a window unit that did not work. 4 adults and 2 children in a place built for 3. And Alma would tell you later that she has never in her life been so tired, or so certain. Ernesto got work washing dishes at a steakhouse out by the highway. Night shift. He rode a bicycle he bought for $11 because the bus did not run late enough to get him home. And he did that for 2 years. And in those 2 years, he was promoted exactly 1 time. From dish pit to prep. And the promotion came with a raise of 35 cents an hour. And he came home and told his wife about it, like a man announcing a lottery. Alma cleaned rooms at a motel off Interstate 10. 17 rooms a shift. She taught herself English off the television in those rooms while she worked, with the sound up, half an ear on daytime programs, and she will tell you to this day that she learned the past tense from a soap opera and the word appliance from a commercial. Here is a thing about that couple that I want you to have in your head before anything else happens, because it is the engine of this whole story. Neither of them ever once described any of that as a sacrifice. That word came later, and it came from other people, and Ernesto in particular disliked it. He would say, when somebody used it, that a sacrifice is when you give something up and get nothing. He would say, I gave up nothing. I was buying something. There is a difference, and it is not small. What he was buying was not a house, and it was not a truck. Rosa was born in the summer of 1991 at a county hospital at 4 in the morning, which her father always said was a sign because that is exactly when a taqueria opens. They did not have a taqueria yet. That came 3 years later. And the way it came is worth telling properly because people imagine these places just appear. There was a building on the corner. It had been an ice house in the 1950s and a laundromat in the 70s, and by 1994 it was empty, with brown paper in the windows and a landlord named Mr. Whitfield who owned 4 buildings on that street and who had a bad hip and no patience. Ernesto had been walking past it for 6 years. The rent he needed was $1,100 a month, and the build-out he needed was about $9,000 he did not have. And no bank in the state of Texas in 1994 was going to hand $9,000 to a prep cook with an accent and no credit history. So he did it the way it actually gets done, which almost nobody outside those neighborhoods knows about. There is a thing called a tanda. It goes by different names in different places, You get 11 or 12 people together who trust each other, and everybody puts in the same amount every week. And every week one person takes the whole pot, and you go around until everybody has had a turn. It is not charity, and it is not a loan, and there is no interest. It is a way of turning many small piles into one big pile, and it runs entirely on the fact that you have to see these people at church and at the store for the rest of your life. Alma ran a tanda for 2 years with women from the motel and from the parish. $20 a week. When their turn came around, they took the pot, and they took it again the next cycle. And Ernesto worked doubles, and by the fall of 1994, they had $6,000. Mr. Whitfield came down on the rent by $100 a month and gave them 2 months free if they did the build-out themselves, which he did not do out of the goodness of his heart, but because that corner had been empty for 4 years, and a bad hip does not fix itself. Ernesto did the build-out with a cousin and 2 friends over 5 weeks of nights. He tiled the floor himself, badly, and it stayed badly tiled for 30 years, and there is a spot near the register where the tile rises up about 1/4 of an inch, and every single person who ever worked there learned to step over it without thinking. They opened on a Monday in January of 1995. They called it Taqueria La Reina, the Queen. Ernesto painted the sign himself, and there is a photograph of him on a ladder that day with a paint can hooked over his arm. And in the photograph, he is not smiling, because he was concentrating. And Alma will point at that photograph and tell you that this is exactly the problem with the only picture they have of that day. The first week, they made $140. Not a day, a week. The second week was worse. Alma cried in the walk-in once, for about 4 minutes, and then washed her face and went back out. Ernesto did not sleep for most of that month, and he did a thing that turned out to be the entire hinge of their lives. And it was not clever, and it was not a business strategy. He started opening at 4 in the morning. Not because anybody asked, because he had ridden a bicycle home from a steakhouse at midnight for 2 years, and he knew exactly who was awake in that part of town before dawn. And he knew that not one place on that side was open to feed them. The men who worked concrete met their crew trucks at 5:30. The women who cleaned the office buildings downtown caught the first bus at 4:40. The night shift at the plant let out at 6. The nurses coming off at the clinic. The bakers, who are always the loneliest people in any city because they are done working when everybody else is starting. By March, there were 9 men standing outside that door at 4:15 in the morning, waiting for it to be unlocked. That is how it happened. Not a recipe, not a secret, not a viral anything which did not exist yet. A man who had been cold and hungry at 4 in the morning himself decided to be open at 4 in the morning. And 30 years came out of that one decision. By 1998, La Reina fed that block. I want you to picture what that actually means, because we throw the phrase around. It means that Ramon the crossing guard ate there every school day for 22 years. It means that the mail carrier on that route, a woman named Dolores, had a plate that started going together when she came around the corner before she was even through the door. It means that the men from the tire shop across the street came in shifts so that somebody was always minding the shop, and that Ernesto knew which one of them was diabetic and quietly changed what went on his plate without ever once discussing it with him. It means that when the clinic on the corner had its Christmas party, it had it at La Reina, and Ernesto closed the front and did not charge for the room, 29 years in a row. And it means the notebook. Now, I have to tell you about the notebook, because the notebook is the reason I wanted to tell you this story at all. and because there is a version of it in a drawer in that building tonight. Ernesto kept a spiral notebook under the register. Not a ledger, a cheap one, the kind you buy in August in a bin for 80 cents. When somebody could not pay, he wrote their name in it and what they owed. That is all. There was no interest, there was no deadline, and here is the part that took Rosa about 25 years to fully understand. There was no collection. He never once asked anybody for the money. Not one time in 30 years. If they paid, he crossed it out. If they did not, the name stayed there, and he fed them again the next week. And the number got bigger, and he did not mention it. He filled a notebook about every 3 years. He kept every one of them. They were in a cardboard box on the shelf above the water heater. And at the end of this story, I am going to tell you what happened when somebody finally added them up. So that is the world Rosa Delgado grew up in. She did her homework in the second booth from the window, the one with the crack in the vinyl, from the time she was 4 years old until the day she left for college. She learned to count on a register drawer. She rolled silverware into paper napkins so fast that grown women were impressed by it. And she could carry 3 plates when she was 9, though her mother did not let her do it out front, where a health inspector might see. And she smelled like the griddle, every day, all through school. She is told this next part maybe twice in her life, and it embarrasses her still. In the 8th grade, there was a girl in her class, a nice girl, no villain, who leaned over during a test and said, not unkindly, "Why do you always smell like tacos?" And Rosa Delgado, 13 years old, went home and stood in the shower until the hot water ran out. For about 4 years after that, she did not tell people what her parents did. She would say, "They have a small business." She got very good at that sentence. When friends wanted to come over, she made other plans. When the school asked parents to come talk about their jobs on career day, she told her mother the school had canceled it. Her mother knew. Of course she knew. Alma had cleaned 17 motel rooms a day for 4 years, and she was not a woman who missed things. And she never said one word about it, not then, and not later. And when Rosa finally apologized for it at 26 years old, at a kitchen table, crying, her mother said only, "Mija, you were a child. And being ashamed of your mother is a thing that happens for about 6 years, and then stops. And if it stops, that is all that matters." Rosa was a straight-A student, not because she was pushed, although she was, but because in that house school was not a subject. It was the entire architecture of the family, and everybody knew it without anybody saying it. There was one rule that Ernesto never broke, and it drove her crazy at the time. She was not allowed to work the griddle. She could bus, she could rap, she could run the register on a Saturday. But when she asked, at 15, to be taught the flat top, her father, who taught 2 nephews and a neighbor's kid and 3 separate employees over the years, said no. She asked again at 16, and he said no. She asked at 17, and he said no. And she got angry about it, and he took his apron off and sat down across from her and said the thing she would think about for the next 20 years. He said, "I can teach you this in 1 summer. Then you will always have it, and it will always be there for you. And on the day something goes wrong in your life, this will be the easy answer." He said, "I do not want you to have an easy answer that ends with you standing here." Then he said, "I did not carry a suitcase across 2 countries so my daughter could learn my griddle. Learn something I cannot do. That is the whole point of me." She went to the University of Texas at Austin on a mix of scholarship, loans, and a check her parents wrote every August that she did not learn the true size of until she was 34 years old. She studied accounting. She will tell you she chose it because she was good at it, and that is true. And she will also tell you, if it is late enough and she has had a glass of wine, that she chose it because it was the furthest thing she could imagine from a hot kitchen. Air conditioning, a desk, numbers that hold still. She passed all 4 parts of the CPA exam by 24. She got hired at a firm in Austin. She had a downtown apartment with a dishwasher she rarely used, a good salary, and a boyfriend named Chris, who worked in software project management and who was, in a way that will matter later, an extremely steady person. And she went home about 6 times a year. And every single time she went home, her father asked her to explain her job to him. And every single time she explained it, he would listen with total concentration and then say, "So you fix their books?" And she would say, "More or less." And he would nod, like a man being handed proof of something. He put her business card in a plastic sleeve and taped it to the wall behind the register. It was there for 11 years. It faded until you could not read it. Now, here is where the story turns. And it turns on a Tuesday in April at 2 p.m, when Rosa was 33 years old and sitting in a conference room in a glass building in Austin. Her phone lit up. Her mother. Which was not normal, because her mother texted, and because at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, her mother was working. She let it go. It rang again immediately. She stepped out into the hallway. Alma's voice was very calm, which is how Rosa knew. She said, "Mija, your father burned his hand." Rosa said, "How bad?" And her mother said the sentence that changed the direction of 5 people's lives. She said, "That is not the problem. The problem is he did not feel it." Ernesto Delgado had been a diabetic for 11 years. He knew it. He had a doctor at the clinic on the corner, the same clinic that had its Christmas party in his dining room. And he took his medication most of the time. And he had been told more than once by more than one person that he needed to come in every 3 months and get his feet checked and his eyes checked and his blood work done. He went about once a year. Maybe. He was fine. That is what he said. Estoy bien. He said it the way men of that generation say it, which is not as a report on his condition, but as a way of closing a subject. Neuropathy is the word. What it means, in plain language, is that the nerves in the hands and the feet stop reporting. They do not die all at once. They go quiet by degrees, over years, so slowly that the person it is happening to adjusts around it without ever noticing that they are adjusting. He had been dropping things for 2 years. He had stopped doing the fine knife work in about February and handed it to the kid who came in at 6. And he had told himself that was because his eyes were tired. And on that Tuesday in April, he set the heel of his right hand down on the edge of the flat top, which was at 350 degrees, and left it there for what the doctor estimated was somewhere between 4 and 6 seconds, because nothing in his arm told him to move it. He noticed because of the smell. Rosa drove down that night. It is an hour and 20 minutes from Austin if you drive the way she drove that night. Her father was at the kitchen table at her parents' house, with his hand wrapped, watching the news, furious. Not about the hand, about the fact that Alma had closed the shop for a day. He said, "We have never closed." And Rosa said, "Dad, you have closed for hurricanes." He said, We closed for one hurricane, and we opened at noon. They took him back to the wound clinic twice a week for 6 weeks. It healed. Second degree, mostly. One patch that was worse. He was lucky, and everybody involved told him so, and he took that as vindication. But something had come into that house and sat down and would not leave, and it was not the burn. Rosa watched him at dinner 3 weeks later. He was holding a fork, and she watched him look at his own hand, quickly, the way you check a mirror, and then adjust his grip. And she understood in about a second and a half that he had been doing that for 2 years, and that she had been at that table for 2 years and had never once seen it, because she had not been looking. She said in the car on the way back to Austin, out loud to nobody, "Well, here is the part where I have to be honest with you, and where this story stops being a movie." She did not quit her job the next morning and drive home and put on an apron. That is what happens in the movie. What happened in real life was 4 months of a very tired woman doing arithmetic in the middle of the night. She had $74,000 in student loans, of which about 30 was still outstanding. She had a promotion coming in the fall that she had worked 6 years for. She had a life in a city, and a boyfriend, and a gym membership, and a person she had become on purpose. And she had 2 people in their 60s on a corner in San Antonio who had opened a door at 4 in the morning for 30 years, and one of whom could no longer feel a hot plate. I want to say something here about a certain kind of pressure that a lot of you listening tonight know from the inside, and that other people genuinely do not understand. When your parents come to a country with 2 suitcases and stand behind a griddle for 30 years so that you can sit at a desk, they have handed you a debt that has no number on it. And it cannot be paid back. Not really, because the thing they bought is you, and you cannot hand it over. Some families make that debt into a weapon. Some parents remind their children of it at every holiday until it poisons the whole thing. Ernesto and Alma Delgado never did. Not once. Her father would rather have swallowed the tiles off that floor than say to his daughter, "Look what we gave up for you." In fact, he did the opposite, aggressively. When she called that summer and started to bring it up, he cut her off and said, "You have a job. Do your job. We are fine." And that, right there, is exactly what made it impossible. Because a debt that is demanded, you can argue with. A debt that is refused sits in your chest and does not move. She talked to Chris about it in July, at 11 at night, on a balcony in Austin, expecting an argument. And Chris, who had met her parents 9 times and who had once spent an entire Saturday helping Ernesto replace a compressor while communicating almost entirely through pointing, said, "So how would it work?" Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "What about us?" He said, "How would it work?" And he got a legal pad. She loves him for a lot of reasons. That is the top one. The plan they built over the next 6 weeks was not romantic, and I'm going to tell it to you in full, because the reason this story has a happy ending, and 1,000 others do not, is entirely in the boring parts. She went to her firm and asked for a 4-month leave of absence, unpaid, and was told no. Then she asked to go to 80% time, working remote with a reduced book of clients, and was told, after 11 days of silence, yes, provisionally, for 1 year. That was the single most important yes in this story, and it came from a woman named Denise in a human resources department who had never met Ernesto Delgado in her life. She rented out her Austin apartment on a 1-year lease. She moved into her old bedroom, which had been converted into a room for the sewing machine and 11 years of storage, at 33 years old. And she lay in that twin bed the first night, listening to the same streetlight buzz she had listened to in high school. And she told her parents she was doing it in the only way they would have accepted, which was a lie of framing. She told them she was coming for a year to help modernize the books because the firm had a program. She said the word program a lot. Her mother did not believe a word of it. Her father chose to. The first Monday, she got there at 3:40 in the morning, because that is when her father got there. He looked at her in the doorway in the dark and said, "Go back to sleep." She said, "Show me the beans." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Put your hair up." That was the first day of the year that this whole story is actually about. Now, I promised you there is no villain in this, and there is not, but there was a problem, and the problem was in the numbers. And it took Rosa Delgado, a licensed certified public accountant, with 6 years at a real firm, about 9 days to find it, and about 4 months to stop being angry about it. Her parents' restaurant was losing money. Slowly. Quietly. And it had been for at least 4 years. Not because anybody stole, not because business was down. Business was not down. That dining room did between 230 and 290 covers a day, 6 days a week, and had for a decade. They were losing money because of a set of decisions that were, each one on its own, an act of love. The prices had not gone up meaningfully since 2011. Rosa found the old printed menus in a drawer. A plate that cost $4.50 in 2011 cost $5.25 when she got there, in a year when the beef in it had nearly doubled. She sat her father down with the invoices and showed him. And he said, "I know." She said, "You know?" He said, "Of course I know. I buy the meat." And then he said, "And if I put that plate at $8.50, Ramon does not eat here anymore. Dolores does not eat here anymore. The men from the tire shop come twice a week instead of 5 times. He said, "I did not open at 4 in the morning for people who can pay $8.50. She said, "Dad, you are subsidizing the entire block out of your retirement." And her father, 66 years old, with a scar on the heel of his right hand, looked at his daughter and said, "Yes." Not defensively, not as an argument, as a simple confirmation of a fact he had decided on a long time ago and had never once revisited. That was the night Rosa went out and sat in her car in the parking lot behind the building for 40 minutes. Because she did not want anybody to see her face. Because she had come home with a plan. She had come home with a spreadsheet and a pricing model and a labor schedule. And every single one of those things was correct. And every single one of them was going to take something away from somebody. And she had grown up eating at that counter. She knew every one of those names. She had done her algebra homework 8 feet from Ramon the crossing guard for 11 years. She sat in that car and understood that she had been handed a thing that could not be solved by being right. So she did the thing that good accountants actually do, which has nothing to do with numbers and which nobody puts in the movies. She stopped talking for 6 weeks and watched. She worked every station. She wrapped, she ran the register, she took the trash out. At 2 in the afternoon, in August, in South Texas, which is an experience that will teach a person humility. And she kept a legal pad in her apron and wrote down what she saw. And what she saw was that there were 4 different restaurants operating inside that one building. and her parents were pricing all 4 of them like it was still the first one. There was the 4 in the morning restaurant. Working men and women, cash, in and out in 9 minutes. The same order every day for years. Thin margins by design. That was the one her father had built the whole thing around, and that was the one he would have gone to the mat over. There was the lunch restaurant, 11 to 2, which was a completely different crowd. Office people from the 2 medical buildings up the street. People who drove in. People, Rosa noticed, who ordered a drink and who left tips on a card and who did not blink at anything. There was the weekend restaurant, which was families, and which was double the ticket size, and which had a line out the door on Saturday and Sunday mornings for the barbacoa that her father made overnight on Fridays and did not charge enough for. And there was the catering, which was not a business at all. It was a series of favors that her mother had been doing for churches, clinics, quinceañeras, and funerals for 2 decades, sometimes at cost, sometimes at less, and which was consuming about 9 hours of Alma's week and producing almost nothing. Rosa built the model on that legal pad over 3 nights. Then she went to her father, and she did not bring a spreadsheet. She brought a single sheet of paper with 6 lines on it, and she put it on the table between them. And she said this. She said, "The 4 in the morning menu does not change. Not one item, not one price. That is a rule, and I will write it down, and I will sign it." He looked up at her. She said, "Everything after 10 in the morning is a different restaurant, and it is going to be priced like one." And that was the negotiation. That was the whole thing. 20 seconds. He said, "The men do not come after 10. She said, "No, they do not." He picked up the paper and read the 6 lines twice. Then he said, "And Ramon?" She said, "Ramon eats at 6:15, Dad. Ramon is fine." He put the paper down and said, "Okay." And that was it. And she went into the walk-in and stood there for a minute, the way her mother had done in 1995. The rest of it was unglamorous, and I love it. So I am going to give it to you. The lunch plates went up an average of $2.80, and lunch traffic did not drop at all. Not 1%. It went up, actually, over the next year, which Rosa had expected, and which her father took about 8 months to believe. She killed 4 menu items. Not because anybody hated them, because nobody ordered them, and each one required an ingredient that came in a case and rotted. She got a real price for the catering and put it in writing and made her mother stop quoting it verbally in the parking lot at church. She found that they had been paying $111 a month for a phone line that went to a fax machine that had not worked since 2017. She found that they were being charged for dumpster service by 2 separate companies, which had started when one bought the other and had continued for 4 years. She found that the credit card processor her parents had signed with in 2009 from a man who had come into the store in a golf shirt was taking 3.9% plus a per-swipe fee, roughly double the going rate, and she moved that in one afternoon with 2 phone calls, and that single act put about $900 a month back in their pocket. And she found, and this is the one that made her put her head down on the desk, that in 30 years, nobody had ever depreciated the equipment. Not the walk-in, not the flat top, not the hood, not the 2019 fryer. Her parents had been overpaying their taxes for most of 2 decades because their tax preparer was a guy named Freddie who worked out of a strip mall next to a nail salon and who was, in Rosa's professional opinion, doing his sincere best. None of that is dramatic. Add it up, and by the following spring, the corner was making a real profit for the first time since about 2017. Not a big one, a real one. But that is not the part of this year I actually wanted to tell you about. The part I wanted to tell you about is the box. It is a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, that used to hold recipe cards from a company that made mixes in the 1970s. It is olive green. It has a hinge that catches. Inside it are about 140 index cards in Alma Delgado's handwriting, and about 30 in the handwriting of Alma's mother, who died in 1999, and who Rosa remembers only as a smell of talcum powder and a hand on the back of her head. And Rosa, who had passed all 4 parts of the CPA exam by the age of 24, could not use a single one of them. Because here is what an index card in that box looks like. It says at the top, Salsa de la Casa. And then it lists, in order, 6 ingredients, with no amounts next to any of them. And at the bottom it says, in Spanish, in her mother's tidy hand, until it tastes right. That is the recipe. That is the whole recipe. She took a photograph of 11 of those cards and sent them to Chris in Austin, at midnight, with a message that said, "This is what I am working with." He wrote back, "That is the most beautiful and infuriating thing I have ever seen." So she did what she does. She got a scale, a notebook, and a stack of deli containers, and she started reverse engineering her family in grams. It took her 4 months, and it did not work. Oh, she got close. She got very close on some of them. The beans she got exactly, because beans are chemistry, and chemistry can be written down. The marinade she got to about 90%. But the house salsa, the one that was on every table in a squeeze bottle, the one that people from 3 neighborhoods over drove across town for, and that a man from Chicago had once tried to buy the rights to in 1999, would not resolve. She would make it to spec. Exactly to spec. 212 grams of this, 180 of that, the same chiles, the same pan, the same everything. And she would taste it, and it would be a very good salsa, made by a very intelligent person. And her father would taste it, off a spoon, and he would look at the ceiling for a second, and he would say, "More time." Or he would say, "The fire was too fast." Or he would say, "That tomato was sad." Which is not a measurement. That is not a thing you can put in a column. Now, he could not cook anymore. That is the thing sitting under all of this that neither of them said out loud for months. His hands were quiet, and they were not coming back, and everybody in that family knew it, and nobody used the words. He could hold a spoon. He could not hold a knife with any confidence, and he had no business standing at a 350-degree flat top. And after the burn, Alma had made one flat statement on the subject, in the kitchen, in October, and he had not argued with her. And that was the end of 40 years of Ernesto Delgado cooking for a living. He came in every day anyway. He sat in the second booth from the window, the one with a crack in the vinyl, where his daughter had done her homework. And he greeted every single person who came through that door, and he was miserable, in a way he would never have admitted. And then, on an evening in March, Rosa made the salsa for the 11th time and put a spoon in front of him. And he did the ceiling thing, and he said no. And she lost her temper. She said, "Dad, I have your ingredients. I have your pan. I have your stove. I have measured everything you have ever put in this to the gram. I need you to tell me what is missing." And her father, who had a 4th grade education from a village school, and a scar on his right hand, said, "Come here." He got up. He walked her back to the comal, the flat round pan he had used for the chiles since 1995, and he had her put it on the fire. He said, "Put your hand over it, not on it, over it." She did. He said, "Now wait." They stood there for what she says was probably 90 seconds and felt like a week. And then he said, "Now." She put the chilies down and they hit that pan and made the sound, and he said, "That is the sound. You have been listening for the timer. There is no timer. There is a sound." He stood behind her for the next 40 minutes with his ruined hands folded behind his back, and he taught her the entire thing without touching one item, using only his voice and his nose. He would say, "Smell it now," and she would, and he would say, "That is not it yet." And then, at some point, he would say, "Now," and she would take it off, and once she pulled it 30 seconds late, and he said nothing at all, and she knew, and she started over without being told. That is how it is passed down. Not on the card. The card is the shopping list. The rest of it goes from a man who cannot feel his hands into his daughter's hands, by sound and by smell. Standing at a comal at 9 o'clock at night, in a building on a corner, in the same room where he had told her at 17 that he would not teach her this because he wanted more for her. She got it in April, on a Thursday. She made it, and he tasted it, and he did not look at the ceiling. He put the spoon down, and he looked out the window for a while. And then he said, in Spanish, "That is your grandmother's." And then he went out to the truck and sat in it for a while, and Rosa let him. Now, I told you at the beginning that there is no villain in this story, and I have kept my word so far, and I am going to keep it. But I did not say there was no crisis. The crisis came in a business envelope on the 15th of June. Mr. Whitfield, the landlord with the bad hip, who had come down $100 a month in 1994, and who had raised the rent maybe 6 times in 30 years, and never by much, had died the previous winter at the age of 91. Ernesto had gone to the funeral in a suit he owned for exactly 2 occasions. The letter was from an attorney representing the estate. It was polite, and it was clear. The 4 buildings on that street were being sold. All of them. Together or separately, but sold this calendar year, because there were 4 heirs in 3 states, and none of them wanted a strip of commercial property in San Antonio, and all of them wanted their share. The building housing Taqueria La Reina was appraised at $310,000. The estate would entertain an offer from the current tenant at that price, with a 60-day window, before it went to the open market. And attached to the letter, because the attorney was thorough, was a copy of a written expression of interest from a development company out of Austin that wanted all 4 buildings on that corner together and had a number in mind for the package. Alma read it first. She read it 3 times at the kitchen table, and then she went and stood at the sink with her back to the room, which is what that woman does. Ernesto read it and put it down and said, "Well." And Rosa read it and did what she is built to do, which is that she got a pen. 60 days, $310,000 for a building they had rented for 30 years. And $31,000 of it, minimum, in cash, up front, plus closing costs, if she could find any lender on earth willing to look at them. She had about $19,000 of her own after a year at 80% salary in her parents' spare room. Her parents had $11,000 and a certificate of deposit that Alma did not want to touch because it was, and I am quoting Alma here, for the funerals. I want to stop here for 1 minute, because this is the middle of the story, and because if you have been listening from the beginning, you might have noticed something. For 30 years, that corner had been feeding a neighborhood at prices that did not make sense, and writing names in a notebook that nobody ever collected on, and closing the front room every December for a clinic that could not afford a hall. There is a kind of person who would tell you that was foolish, that a man who does that is bad at business and will end up with nothing. Stay with me. The last part of this is the part I have been wanting to tell you. Rosa gave herself 8 days to build the package, and she built it the way you would build one for a client paying $400 an hour. 3 years of clean returns, which existed only because she had spent a year fixing them. A profit and loss statement that finally reflected reality. A rent history going back to 1995, which Alma had kept in a shoebox. Every single canceled check, because that woman does not throw away paper. A 12-page plan with an appraisal, a repair schedule, and 3 years of projections that she deliberately made conservative because a lender who catches you being optimistic stops reading. She took it to a credit union on Nogalitos Street, to a lender named Marisol Cantu, who read the whole thing at her desk while Rosa sat there, which took 35 minutes, and which Rosa says was the longest 35 minutes of her professional life. At the end of it, Marisol took her glasses off and said, "This is the cleanest package I have seen from a restaurant in 4 years. Who did this?" Rosa said, "I did." And Marisol said, "Then here is what is wrong with it." She said, "The business supports the debt. That is fine. That is not my problem. My problem is that you need about $31,000 down on an SBA 7A loan at this price. And you need closing costs on top. Call it 8. And I need to see reserves after that, or my committee will not go. And you are showing me $30,000 in cash between 3 adults." She said, "You are about 20,000 short, and you have 51 days. Rosa drove home and sat in the parking lot again, in her spot, behind the building. And that night at the kitchen table, she said the word out loud, which was help. And her father said no before she got to the end of the sentence. I need to explain something about that man, and I am going to be careful, because it is not simple pride and it is not stubbornness, although it looks like both from the outside. Ernesto Delgado had been in this country for 37 years at that point. In 37 years, he had not taken a single dollar of anything. Not a program, not a loan from a person, not a hand from the parish. Nothing. That was not politics, and it was not a lecture he gave anybody. It was the entire structure holding him up. He said, "I have fed those people. That is not a bill. If I go and put it in front of them as a bill, then everything I did for 30 years turns into something else. Retroactively. All of it." And you know, he is not wrong. That is the terrible part. He is not wrong. Rosa said, "So we lose the corner." And her father said, "Then we lose the corner." We came here with 2 suitcases. He said, "We are not less than we were on the bus." He went to bed. Her mother stayed at the table. Alma Delgado sat there for a while, turning her coffee cup. And then she said, in Spanish, "He is right about himself." And then she said, "He is not right about them." And then she said, "I am not going to ask anybody." And Rosa said, "Okay." And her mother said, "I am simply not going to lie to Dolores." Dolores was the mail carrier. 26 years on that route. She had put the certified envelope from the estate attorney in Alma's hand herself, and she had watched Alma's face. And a woman who has carried mail on the same street for 26 years knows exactly what the return address of a law firm handling an estate means when it lands on a business. She asked on a Wednesday, at 10:15 in the morning, at the counter, and Alma, who was not going to ask anybody for anything, but who was also not going to look Dolores in the face and lie to her, told her the truth in about 9 sentences. It took, by Rosa's estimate, 40 hours for that entire side of town to know. Ramon the crossing guard came in at 6:15 the next morning, like always, and ate, like always, and paid, like always, and then put a coffee can on the counter with a plastic lid on it, and walked out before anybody could open it. There was $2,240 in it. In cash. Some of it in ones. Ramon had been a crossing guard for 22 years and had never made more than $16 an hour in his life. Ernesto tried to give it back, and Ramon would not take it. He said, and I am told he said it in the crosswalk with his stop sign in his hand, "Tell him it is for the plates I ate in 1999. Then the women from the parish restarted the tanda, not the old one, a new one, and a big one. 31 people at $40 a week. And they voted, formally, at somebody's kitchen table, that the Delgados would take the first 4 pots. Then the tire shop across the street printed tickets. I have to tell you about the plate sale, because if you are from South Texas, you already know. And if you are not, this is one of the great American institutions, and almost nobody outside of it has heard of it. When somebody in that part of the world needs money for a funeral, or a surgery, or a kid's medical bills, there is a plate sale. Somebody cooks, everybody else sells tickets, in advance, at work, at church, at the shop, out of a cooler in a parking lot. $15 a plate. You show up on Saturday morning with your ticket, and you get a phone container with meat, rice, beans, and 2 tortillas, and you take it back to your job. They sold 480 tickets in 9 days. The clinic on the corner bought 80 of them at once for its staff. The 2 medical buildings up the street bought 110 between them, which is the lunch crowd Rosa had raised prices on, and not one of whom had ever stopped coming. The morning of the sale, Ernesto could not cook it because of his hands. So the man who could not cook it stood at the pass in an apron and called out the tickets. And 4 men from the tire shop, and 2 of his nephews, and a retired cook named Hava, who had worked there in 2004, did the actual work under his voice. They netted $5,900. And on the Tuesday after that, a man in a suit came in at 11 in the morning and sat down at the counter and ordered the lunch plate and ate all of it, and then asked to speak to the owner. His name was Alberto Ruiz. He was 41 years old. He ran a mechanical contracting company with 58 employees and offices in San Antonio and New Braunfels, and he had grown up 2 streets over. His mother had cleaned houses. In 1998 and 1999, when he was 14 and 15, she had gone through a stretch, and he and his brother had eaten at that counter probably 300 times without ever once paying. And his name, or rather his mother's name, was in one of those spiral notebooks on the shelf above the water heater. He took out a checkbook, and Ernesto said no. I love this part. Rosa was standing right there, and she says her whole chest went cold, because she could see $31,000 in a man's hand, and she could see her father's face, and she knew exactly which one was going to win. Alberto Ruiz put the checkbook away without a word. Then he said, "All right, different question. I have 58 employees, and I feed my crews on Fridays. Right now, I am buying them pizza from a chain in Selma, and they hate me for it. He said, I want to sign a contract with you for Friday lunch for a year. 50 plates a week. That is a real number. I am not doing you a favor. I want a price, and I want an invoice. And then he said, and I want to pay the first 6 months up front, because that is how my accountant likes it, before the end of the fiscal year. That last part was, as everybody at that counter understood perfectly well, a lie of the highest quality. Ernesto Delgado looked at that man for a long moment, and then he asked one question, which was, on the Fridays, does your crew come here, or do I deliver? And Alberto said, we come here. And Ernesto said, then we have a contract. $10,400, paid in advance, for 6 months of Friday lunches that his company actually ate every single Friday at that counter and still eats 5 years later at 11:30, 58 men and women in work boots taking up the entire dining room. That is how you help a proud man. You do not hand him a check. You buy something from him, and you pay for it early. If you take one practical thing away from this story tonight, let it be that one, because you will get a chance to use it. They closed on the building on a Thursday morning in September, with a 3-week extension the estate granted without being asked, because the attorney had gotten interested. The title company office was in a strip center with a fountain out front that did not work. There were 4 chairs. Ernesto wore the suit he owned for 2 occasions. Alma wore the dress she wore to weddings. The closer slid the stack across and said, most people just sign the flags. And Ernesto Delgado said, in his English, which after 37 years was perfectly good, and which he had always been quietly self-conscious about, I would like to know what each one says. It took 90 minutes. Rosa translated where he wanted it and let it alone where he did not. He asked 11 questions. 2 of them were good enough that the closer had to go look something up. And then he signed his name, which he wrote the old way, with the flourish under it that he had learned in a village school in the 1960s, on a document making him the owner of a building on a corner where he had first stood on the sidewalk in 1988 and looked at brown paper in the windows. He did not cry at the title company. He cried in the truck, briefly, with the door open and 1 foot on the ground, and Alma sat in the passenger seat and looked straight ahead and let him. Then they drove back and opened for lunch, because it was Thursday, and Thursday is a work day. He walked in through the front instead of the back, which he never did, and he stopped just inside the door, and he pressed the toe of his good shoe down on that piece of tile near the register that rises up 1/4 of an inch, and that he had laid himself, badly, in 1994. He pressed on it a couple of times, the way you test a floorboard. Then he took his jacket off and went and sat in the second booth by the window and told the first person who came in about the fountain that did not work. 2 weeks later, Rosa got the cardboard box down from the shelf above the water heater. There were 10 spiral notebooks in it. Some of them had gotten damp at some point, and the covers had gone wavy. The oldest one was from 1995, and the handwriting in it was younger. She sat at the second booth for 3 nights after close with those notebooks and a laptop, and she entered every single line into a spreadsheet, which is the most Rosa Delgado activity that has ever occurred. 30 years. Names, dates, amounts. Some entries were 60 cents. Some were $40. Some names appeared twice and never again. Some names went on for pages, for months, and then stopped. And next to a few of those, her father had drawn a single small cross. And Rosa had to stop for a while when she worked out what that meant. The total was $61,384 and change. $61,000 of food, given away over 30 years by a man who never once mentioned it to anybody, including his wife, including his daughter, including the people who owed it. And in 60 days, when that corner was going to be lost, the same neighborhood put back into his hands, in coffee cans and plate tickets and a tanda and a Friday lunch contract and $40 at a time, a little over $23,000. A little over a third of it. Rosa sat there at 11 at night with that number on a screen, a professional who values things for a living, and she wrote in the margin of a legal pad, and she has that page framed in her office now. Return on investment, 30 years, 38%, plus a building. That is a joke. It is also the truest accounting anybody in that family ever did. So, here is what happened next, which is the part I have been saving. That was 5 years ago. Taqueria La Reina is open. It opens at 4 in the morning, 6 days a week, and the 4 in the morning menu has still never changed. Not one item and not one price, which is a rule that is written down on a piece of paper, in a frame, in the office. Rosa signed it. She meant it. Rosa Delgado is 39 years old. She left the firm in Austin at the end of the second year, which she had promised herself she would not do, and which she does not regret. She still keeps 6 clients, all of them small businesses on that street, and she does their books on Tuesday afternoons in the back office with the door open, and the barber next door pays her in haircuts for a family of 3, which is a rate she negotiated hard. She married Chris at the parish 2 streets over. The reception was in the dining room. They pushed the tables against the wall, and there were 160 people, and the fire marshal was one of them, and he ate 2 plates and said nothing. Her father did not cook at his daughter's wedding. He sat at the head table and watched 2 of his nephews and a retired cook named Java run his kitchen, and Alma held his hand under the table the whole time. They have a daughter. Her name is Lucia, and she is 4 years old. And here is the thing I most wanted to tell you tonight. Every Sunday morning, before the doors open, Ernesto Delgado, who is 71 years old and who cannot feel his own fingertips, puts his granddaughter on a milk crate in front of the comal. He does not let her touch anything. He is extremely strict about it, in the way that only a man with a scar on his hand can be. He has her hold her palm out flat above that pan, at a height he decides, and he says, "Wait." And they wait. A 4-year-old and a 71-year-old in an empty dining room with the lights half on and the day not started yet. And then he says, "Now." She cannot cook. She is 4. That is not the point. The point is that a man whose nerves have gone quiet is teaching a child to use the same sense he has left, which is the one that was never in his hands to begin with. Alma retired from the register at 68. She comes in on Sundays, sits in the second booth by the window, and receives the neighborhood like a woman holding court, which is exactly what the name of that restaurant has always meant, and which took Rosa 35 years to notice. There is a frame by the front door now, next to the light switch, at about eye level. In it is a $1 bill, soft as cloth, with a fold worn white down the middle. It is the first dollar that corner ever took, on a Monday in January of 1995. and Alma had kept it taped to the inside lid of that olive green recipe box for 30 years without telling anybody, including her husband. Rosa found it when she was reverse engineering the salsa. She had it framed. Her father said it was silly and a waste of money, and then he moved the frame 3 times over 2 weeks until it was exactly where he wanted it. And it has not moved since. The notebook is still under the register. Rosa keeps it. Same kind, 80 cents. The ones you buy in August. Same rules. No interest, no deadline, and nobody ever gets asked. She is an accountant. She knows precisely what that notebook does to a balance sheet. She has run the numbers on it, because of course she has. She will tell you, if you ask her, that it is the only asset that corner has ever owned that appreciated. And her father goes to the clinic every 3 months now. Every single time. He has not missed one in 5 years, and it is not because his wife tells him to, and it is not because his daughter tells him to, and it is certainly not because a doctor tells him to. It is because a 4-year-old holds his hand and walks him down there, 1 block, because it is a thing she gets to do, and because she thinks it is an outing, and because that man has never in his life been able to refuse anybody who came to his door wanting something small. So that is the story. 2 suitcases, one of them held shut with a belt. A corner that was empty for 4 years. A man who opened at 4 in the morning because he remembered being hungry at 4 in the morning. And a woman who learned the past tense off a television in a motel room. And a daughter who was not allowed to learn the griddle on purpose, so that she could come back at 33 and learn it anyway, on her own terms, by ear. Nobody in this story got even with anybody. Nobody was exposed. There is no judgment, and no settlement, and no room going silent. There is just a debt that could not be repaid, and a family that stopped trying to repay it and started passing it along instead, which is the only thing you can do with that kind of debt, and which is, I think, what it was always for. And on that corner, tonight, at 4 in the morning, in the dark, the lights will come on, and a flat top will start to tick as it heats. And somewhere down the block, a man waiting for a truck to pick him up will smell coffee and hot oil and know exactly what time it is. Sleep well tonight. Let your shoulders come down off your ears. Picture a warm room with the lights half on and the chairs still up on the tables, and a pan on a low fire, and a small hand held flat above it, and an old man beside her saying, "Wait, wait, not yet." That is a good place to rest. Stay there as long as you like. I will see you in the next one. Before you drift off, tell me something in the comments if you have it in you. What did your parents or your grandparents do so that you could do what you do? And did you ever get to thank them for it properly? Or is it one of those things that never quite gets said out loud? And is there a recipe in your family that nobody wrote down correctly? Because I would love to hear about it. As always, drop your state and how old you are so I know who is out there resting with me tonight. Sleep well. Somebody kept the light on for you, too.